Willkommen in einem neuen Aufregens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 51 of my game system design series of videos. In this video I'll be investigating the rules designer, who may wish to write a set of rules, modify a set of rules, reformat a set of rules, or create rules supporting material. It's only human nature for someone to believe they could do a better job at something than someone else, in this case figure gaming rules. In some cases, this may be accurate, especially if what has been duplicated is an older set of rules. In most cases, it's not accurate, both because that person will soon lose interest and will probably never complete the project, or because what that person is creating is something totally different and cannot be compared with the original set of rules. Even when we wish to perform modifications to an existing set of rules, often these changes will affect other parts of the rules in a negative manner. Writing rules or even modifying an existing set of rules is much harder than may appear on the surface. Once you have attempted this a number of times, this difficulty or the issues become more obvious and will allow us to make a more informed cost ratio benefit calculation before we even begin to do this again. This is a critical factor. The benefit of undertaking this project must make the effort worth it. Otherwise, it's best to move on to another project and just accept the old rules regardless. Beyond the issue with game system mechanics, the other issue is, does the rules fill an existing gap? Creating a set of rules which offer no or minimal benefit to other available sets of rules will generally always fail eventually. This does not mean those new rules are inferior, but because they are developed after other similar rules, there is little incentive for players to go to the effort of learning yet another new set of rules for no real net benefit. There is some benefit from being first. This is a subtle issue, as in many cases the designer will feel their specific fire combat system is far better than another system because they thought of it rather than developing it to actually solve a problem. So let's drill down into the murky subject of designing rules. We will now discuss designing a new set of rules. Before designing a new set of rules, you need to understand what problem these new rules will solve. Some problems that could exist are, there are no existing rules. Existing rules are not historically accurate enough. Existing rules are too complex. Existing rules take too long to play a game. Existing rules do not provide an enjoyable gaming experience. Existing rules have a game system issue. Existing rules require too much record keeping. Existing rules require too much referencing of table, such as reaction tests. Existing rules have too many gamey tactics. Other viable issues to solve have little to do with the actual rules, but are instead involved with the rules ecosystem or formatting, such as existing rules lack training content, existing rules lack equipment data lists, existing rules lack organizational data, existing rules lack scenarios, existing rules lack game aids, existing rules cannot be referenced in a game very easily, existing rules are hard to understand or learn from. The final issue that you may wish to solve is scale, such as there are no rules which allow me to command a division, a corps or an army. Existing rules require a very large playing area which I simply don't possess. You need to identify what your rules will bring to the table which no other set of rules offer today. This does require a lot of research, as you need to understand what rules are available and what they provide. This is not easy, although you can obtain assistance from other players on various forums. Once you've identified your key objective or mission statement, you can now design your rules. As an example, a possible design objective could be a quick play and simple set of rules which allow players to command a corps and complete a game in, let's say, within 2 to 3 hours. This automatically tells you the scale of the rules, which in this case is probably a battalion element scale, a ground scale of about 1 in 60,000, a game turn scale of, let's say, 12 or 24 hours, and a playing area of about 3 to 4 feet. We can also determine some basic game systems. At this scale, there is no need to create a logarithmic scale, as it's common for lower scaled games. So we don't have that issue and do not need rules to cover it. Once we understand what we are creating, based on our objective, the first step is to create an initial draft of the rules. Before you involve other players in order to playtest your rules, it's wise to create a complete initial draft, including a playtest scenario. Your playtesters will need a complete product to test, which may need to go through massive changes and modifications down the system, or downstream. But if it's not complete when you playtest, you cannot perform any meaningful playtesting. This takes a lot of effort and will include solitaire playtesting before you start the multiplayer playtesting process. The rules designer acting as an umpire can also assist in the playtesting process. Creating a complete initial draft is also a good test of your determination to complete the project. The world is filled with partially completed rules. Before you involve other players, it's a good idea to test your resolve by actually creating something which takes some real effort. The process you now need to follow is playtest, implement changes, and playtest again. Once it's at a reasonably complete stage, allow two players to playtest, with you acting as a silent observer. This will bring up rule structure issues, implement changes, and game it again when these do arise. The number of times you need to rinse and repeat depends on the complexity of your rules, but you need to end up with a robust and complete set of rules at the end of this process. Changes may still occur, but these should now be typo or minor changes. Once you have your set of rules, you now need to create the ecosystem to support your rules. These will include game aids such as turn record charts and counters, which are required for gameplay. Cheat sheets, if possible creating a cheat sheet, which is all the player needs to play the game, is the holy grail. It's rarely achieved, but the closer you get, the better the rules will work. Training aids, an examples document is a good idea. While critical examples should be in your rules, more detailed and extensive examples will load down your rules with unnecessary bloat. It's best to place this in a separate document, which would only be viewed when a player is learning the rules and when some unusual situation occurs which requires some guidance. Training videos are also a good idea, but are not necessary unless you are using the video to push your rules. Finally, but far from the least, is the scenarios. While the rules should contain some basic scenarios to assist players to start a game, more detailed and varied scenarios are critical to having a set of rules being accepted. The scenarios themselves may require game aids and cheat sheets, so a lot of thought needs to go into ensuring a player can play the scenario with minimal effort. If creating a fixed historical or pseudo-historical scenario, you need to ensure you have detailed setup instructions. Playing area guidelines, force mix details, deployment details, reinforcement details, victory condition details are all content you need to include in your scenarios. If you're creating a points-based variable scenario, make sure you have the following: a guide on how to set up a playing area, points totals and army list details, deployment guidelines, reinforcements guidelines, if any, victory condition details. If you're creating an ad hoc scenario, such as a card base using points or a random selection of cards with a force listed on them, the same applies. The cards need to be required, stipulating points or random selection process, guide on how to set up a playing area, deployment guidelines, reinforcements guidelines, again, if any, victory condition details. Scenario game aids could also be considered, such as scenario cheat sheets, a sheet showing all required details of the force mix used in the scenario. Depending on how simple or complex your rules are, this can range from unnecessary to essential. The end product should be an entire ecosystem which allows a player with minimal effort to pick up the rules and supporting material, go to a club, set up a game, and play the game until a clear winner and loser has been identified. All effort should be made in minimizing the effort required to perform this. Now for the bad news. While I feel designing a set of rules and holistic ecosystem can be interesting and rewarding, few designers complete the project, and for those who do, few can create something which gains traction. If your rules are free and you post it accordingly, fewer rules get any attention. The only exception I can think of offhand is LWRS, while I can think of a host of rules which exist on the internet and are rarely used. LWRS succeeded because it was the first company element scale set of rules which was complete enough to be usable. The issue with repeating this is that there are few remaining gaps in the market, but perhaps you may find one. This will increase the probability your free rules will succeed. If you're going to create commercial rules, then your chance of gaining traction is greater, but the effort is also greater. In this case, you are forced into completing your rules and providing support, which allows you to create errata which can be applied in a future set of rules. But in this case, you need to ensure your rules have sufficient bling to attract the attention of prospective gamers. As the old saying goes, it's a long way to the top in rock and roll. Let's look at the next project that the budding designer may consider: modifying existing rules. There are many reasons why a player may wish to modify a set of rules. However, in many cases the modifications are subjective. A player's preference, or a player may prefer a type of rules and decides to change a different rule to match what they like. This is very understandable, and if the modification is being executed for a small group of gamers, it's perfectly acceptable. However, if subjective preference is the driver, those modifications are not going to gain any form of traction outside your local gamer community. When you wish to modify a set of rules, it has to solve a clear and present problem. Problems could include: the rules are too complex, movement is too clunky, too much work managing orders or strength points. A good reason to modify a set of rules is to stop gaming tactics, correct obvious errors, or other more basic reasons. Many of these reasons why you would wish to modify a set of rules is identical to those which you could use to justify creating a new set of rules. Some of the problems that you may wish to resolve are: existing rules are not historically accurate enough, existing rules are too complex, existing rules take too long to play, existing rules do not provide an enjoyable gaming experience, existing rules have a game system issue, existing rules require too much record keeping, existing rules require too much referencing of tables such as reaction tests, existing rules have too many gamey tactics. Again, once you've determined what problem you're solving, the next issue is how much modification is required. If the problem is reaction testing is a major game flow issue, removing something as fundamental as reaction tests would require a change in the command and control system and combat system at a minimum. Change so extensive may result in a totally new set of rules. Thus, in this case, you're better off writing a whole new set of rules. If the modifications are too extensive, they stop being modifications and become a new set of rules. The next point about modification is: who is the audience? If the audience is just you and your comrades, then the modifications can be anything you and your comrades wish. If the audience is the general gaming community who uses the rules, the modification needs to be far more targeted and professional. The modifications must fix a clear and obvious issue. The modifications need to be play tested to ensure they do not cause other issues. Some form of consensus from the community needs to be obtained. The best example of this is DBM modifications, which are typically voted on. The modifications need to be well play tested and agreed by the DBM community in the UK. The rest of the world has to fall in line, but as DBM is UK centric, this is understandable. The next project is a rather odd one. I call it conversion. This category conversion is one which I only recently considered, which is taking a set of rules from one medium, period or whatever, and converting it to another medium or period. There are three types of conversions possible. These are converting board game rules to figure game rules or vice versa, converting a set of rules designed for Napoleonics and using it for ancients, taking a game system from one set of rules and inserting it to another. The last type is better covered in the modification section, so I'll focus on the first two in this section only. Converting a set of rules which was designed for one period and moving it to another is common. It could be argued that early ancients, Napoleonics and even World War II rules, particularly from WRG, had many common elements. However, in this case it was not a clean conversion and did involve a lot of period-specific modification. This is the main issue with taking a set of rules from one period and converting to another. You still need to do a lot of modification to suit the new period. Converting a World War II set of rules to Napoleonics would require you to remove most of the World War II rules specific and add specific Napoleonic rules, such as removing air support, anti-armor fire combat, most indirect fire rules, and so on. I have to admit, if we look at board gaming back in the 1970s, the game system designed for the American Civil War ended up moving to Napoleonics and eventually World War II. However, in that case, the game system was very simple: blue and grey, Napoleon at war, and battles in North Africa. But even in this case, some modification was required, specifically for the World War II set of rules. Unless you're dealing with a very simple game system, taking a set of rules from one period and using it for another period can only work with significant modifications and rewrites. In many ways, you're better off writing a set of rules from scratch and simply using the game system elements you like from the other rules. The only exception is if the periods do not differ very much, such as Napoleonics and, let's say, the 7-Year War or even the American Civil War. Then it becomes viable. Taking a set of board gaming rules and converting it into a figure gaming format, or vice versa, is a much more viable project. There are many examples of board games which were designed to be used for figures. The Napoleonic battles, lost battles, and phalanx are three good examples. However, the main issue is these types of conversions is that most board games are designed with some form of grid in mind. A grid, be it a square or hex, detracts from figure gaming or the figure gaming experience, and as such these types of conversions have not been very popular. Some rules, which use square, allow a player to place an almost invisible dot to represent the square. This allows for a better experience, but requires you to place many dots on your playing area surface. It's possible, but not ideal. The same has occurred with at least one set of Napoleonic rules, which attempts to disguise hexes within the terrain. This gives you a good-looking playing area, but the playing area needs to be custom-made. Once again, it's possible, but not ideal, and extremely difficult to achieve. The ideal solution is to eliminate the grids entirely, which does require some modification to the rules, but as the modifications are only designed to remove squares or hexes, these are not specifically game system changes. I originally felt this would be too hard, but after converting a number of board games into a hexless figure gaming format, I've changed my mind. It's actually rather simple and only requires some game aids to represent the zones of control. I'm certain there are many different ways of doing such a conversion, but in simple terms, the concept of a hex or square is replaced with the concept of a base width. An element or unit moves base widths rather than hexes and pays all the same movement allowance costs you would expect in a board game when they cover a base width. This solves movement in a very simple manner. Zones of control are more difficult to represent. If you're looking at simple zones of control, such as you would find in, let's say, the SPI Napoleon at War or Modern Battles quad games, you would need to implement a movement zone of control, which would be half a base width in distance, in all directions from any unit or element. Once an unit touches an enemy movement zones of control, its movement ends. That solves the movement effect of zones of control. For combat purposes, you need a combat zone of control, which is one base width long in length. Any enemy unit within this combat zone of control can be attacked, and in some cases, the board game or game system requires combat to be mandatory. This solves the combat effect of zones of control. These three basic ideas allows you to remove hexes from your playing area entirely. The next step is to find a board game you feel has promise in terms of being converted to a figure game format. I personally went with simplicity, so Modern Battles for World War II and Cold War was my choice. More complex board games could be considered, but once I move to something more complex, it becomes more difficult for new players, and as such is not something I wish to attempt at this point in time. But nonetheless, if that's what you're interested in, it's certainly something that can certainly occur. You also need to ensure you're not converting a board game which gives you the same results as an existing set of figure gaming rules. A good example is the Ney versus Wellington board game, which once converted gives you something very similar to many existing figure gaming sets of rules. So why bother? Why not just simply use the existing figure gaming rules? Always remember the golden rule. If it does not give you something unique, don't bother. Now we come to the enhancing an existing set of rules project, which is my personal favourite. The major benefit of enhancing an existing set of rules is, if there is a gaming community which already uses those rules, then your enhancements could assist those players, as well as yourself and your gaming community. Getting traction becomes possibly more easier. Enhancing a set of rules is a lot simpler than creating or modifying a set of rules. There is minimal, if any, play testing required, as in most cases the rules themselves are unchanged. If you like a specific set of rules, then creating game aids which assist in expanding the rules gaming community is basically what you're attempting, which means you get more opponents. Without making any changes to the set of rules, that is the game mechanics, there are a number of enhancements you can consider. Reformatting the rules. Apply a case system, for example, add cross-referencing and indexes. Create game aids such as a turn record chart, spec sheets, cheat sheets, and any other type of game aid which can assist with playing the game. Expand the equipment lists and organisation charts. Create army lists, create scenarios. Fill any gaps such as seasons, weathers, or anything that may be missed in the original rules. Create examples and training documents, as well as possibly training videos. Reformatting the rules is a major task and in many cases may not be required. For example, Spearhead does not require the rules to be reformatted, as it's a very good learning document and reference document in the form that it currently exists. On the other hand, WRG Microarmor rules often needs to be reformatted, specifically to assist in learning the rules. While the rules are a good reference document, they're certainly not a good learning document. Other rules such as FFT3 are not so good as a reference document, while being a very good learning document. It becomes reasonably easy to determine if a set of rules need to be reformatted. The first time you play a game will tell you where the issues are. A more reasonable enhancement is to create game aids. The standard game cheat sheet is a classic enhancement you could consider. If one already exists, determine if it's adequate or if you can add more stuff on it. Often a set of rules will lack a game turn track. Other game aids could be victory points track, morale track, or any other kind of record keeping which could be converted into a track. Ideally, once you know the rules, you should not need to reference the rules at all. Referencing a cheat sheet or track should be all that is required as you play a game. Each time you have to reference the rules stops the game flow, so it's not a good thing. Referencing the rules is when you may have, the only time you would reference a rule is when you may have forgotten a rule or experience an unusual situation. Otherwise, you need to avoid being forced to constantly reference the rules as you play the game. Expanding the equipment list can be a worthy objective. Rules such as FFT3 do not need this, but Spearhead does, and a club in New Zealand did expend a reasonable effort in expanding the available equipment list many years ago, which people across the world have found useful. I think they did this to run a competition. Expanding or even creating army lists may also be worthwhile. In some cases, this may require you to create a point system if it's lacking in the existing rules. I suspect creating scenarios will end up being the main areas designers will focus on. This could include historical or pseudo-historical scenarios, all the way to a random card-based system to allow players to create quick ad hoc games. This will require playtesting, so it does take a bit of effort. Creating as many scenario aids as possible so your scenarios can be quickly set up, played to completion, and possessing a robust victory determination system is a very good objective. Some rules may possess gaps. The most common are scenario-related, such as campaign rules, deployment, playing area setup, climate, region, season, weather, etc. Rules to cover unusual games are worthwhile to consider if lacking, such as amphibious assaults, airdrops, or storming fortifications. The hardest, most boring, but most useful game aid are training guides or videos. I typically create a large PDF file which lifts every possible game example I can think of, and I must admit not being able to think of every contingency, but nonetheless I hope I cover most of them. Ordering and launching an air operation in Core Commander is a very complex process, so I have many air mission examples in my example documents for those particular rules. Videos can also be very useful, but I must admit they take a lot of effort to create. My personal preference is always to find an existing set of rules and to provide whatever gaming ecosystem is required to speed up play. Even when I convert a board game into a figure game, most of my efforts are in creating the gaming ecosystem around those rules. In this case, my personal rules input is minimal, simply removing hexes, but the gaming ecosystem is critical if I expect those rules to allow me to quickly set up and play a game, particularly with new players. Because of my efforts, I can go to a club now, and as long as I have packed the correct boxes, I can have a game of Ancients, Napoleonics, World War II or Cold War with a totally new player with only minimal effort, all due to using a simple game system with adequate game aids. In order to interest new players, I need this level of flexibility. However, I must admit, most players probably don't need it to the same extent that I do because they're not out there specifically recruiting new players. I have found that enhancing even old sets of rules can give them a new lease of life, as long as the basic game systems are not too old or unplayable. For example, while not perfect, I've found the old, or very old, WRG Micro Armor rules very usable and easy to play. With sufficient game aids and enhancements and robust scenarios, they are another set of rules that I commonly use to gain new players, particularly since you can actually download these old rules from the internet for nothing in a PDF format, so new players can actually do so and study the rules if they so desire. And so this concludes episode 51 of my video on game system design, in this case the types of different rules designers that there are out there. Alle guten Dingen kommen zu einem Ende.